It's go time.
Argonauts head coach Ryan Dinwiddie is upset at the command center over two reviews that impacted apparent Toronto touchdowns. Roughriders lose on a last-place single, but here are those that still do not get the point. No team in the Western Conference has a record above 500, and, as of now, no team in the Western Conference would make the playoffs race in the East. 3 players in the last 3 weeks have been carted off the field in an ambulance: Luther Hakunavanhu, Stanley Bryant, and Jalon Acklin. Is this trend concerning? Welcome to Third Down Gamble, with your hosts, Don Charbin and Heath Graham.
As we look forward to what is the traditional back half of the Canadian Football League season, we are now in a situation that I cannot remember the last time this happened, where the West has no team at this point in the season heading into Labor Day with a winning above 500 record. And the other crazy stat is that every Western team has a 500 record against every other opponent in the West. It's almost returning to the mean.
You want parity, you've got parity. This is what CFL schedule makers dream about, is having a division this close. It's going to come right down to the wire unless a team goes on an absolute tear in the second half. This is going to be a real close battle for all 3 playoff spots. Nobody's eliminated yet. The Elks' 3-game win streak came to an end, but they have been pushing up, and if they continue that trend, they're going to be in the playoff picture as well. So any of the 5 teams at this point can finish anywhere in the standings.
That's exactly right. The gap between first and fifth in the West is 2.5 games, where it entered last week, where it stayed at the end of the week. We had a weekend just prior where all road teams won. This past weekend, all home teams won. And if you were at home in the West, Winnipeg Blue Bombers, that was you. But if you were any of the other Western clubs on the road in the East, that meant one more loss to the column. Do you think that this is a major trend heading towards Eastern dominance like we saw maybe in the 1960s and early 1970s? Or is it a case where the pendulum has just swung just a tiny bit towards the East? But the better thing is that the records are getting closer and closer.
That's a great question, and I would tend to the latter, that it's a slight adjustment over the last couple of seasons. But you look at Montreal this year, you look at the Toronto Argonauts last year, those were regular season domination of what we're seeing of 2 teams. You look at the rest of the division, things are a lot closer to where they are in the West as far as total number of wins. There is a bit of a trend towards the Eastern teams right now. We'll see if that continues. And you have to look at the timing of teams, where they're at as far as their rosters as well. We see Nathan Rourke coming back to BC. There's a lot of hype and a lot of hope that he is going to turn the Lions into a juggernaut team as well. The Blue Bombers are clearly taking a bit of a step back this year from where they were over the previous 4 seasons, maybe aging out a little bit. So I think it's more of that roster adjustment as opposed to a complete swing to the East being the dominant division.
I tend to agree with you on that point, that these are cyclical things. It's at times there is domination on one side of the ledger, and then at other times it's the other way. Now, the West had been the stronger of the 2 sides for quite a few years, but it didn't always translate into Grey Cups, and that was always good for the league because at least you had one powerful matchup coming out of the East, whether that was Montreal or Toronto, and then there was a myriad of teams coming from the West to face them. The Bombers were the one team lately that has dominated the West, that they've been there, but they're only 2-2 of their 4 appearances. And even in the one that they won on their second trip, that was an overtime victory. So it tells you that parity is starting to rule, and that's what you want in a salary cap era.
Absolutely. And you look at their first win when they beat Hamilton in 2019, they were not the favorite team going into that one either. The Hamilton Tiger Cats had a dominant regular season, 15-3, and looked like a surefire Grey Cup champ. So this is exactly what you want. It's a far cry from seeing somebody run away with it and win every year. And fans of those teams love it, right? The Edmonton team of the late 70s, early 80s, those fans absolutely had the best time in the CFL watching their team win 5 consecutive Grey Cups. The rest of the league didn't enjoy that so much. So to see the competition and the ability for one team to beat another anytime is what makes it so entertaining.
And it's interesting, too, south of the border as they get ready for their season to start in the NFL. They've had single-team dominance pretty much from 2000 on. But in that, the team that has been the ultra-dominant team has lost Super Bowls, and that keeps everybody interested, because had New England, for instance, won every time they went there, that would really change the interest in the game, because what's the point in watching? You know who's going to win it at the end of the season anyway.
Exactly. That's the point I'm trying to make here is the CFL, it is so entertaining because those upsets happen. And we see teams go in as the favorites. Last year when the playoffs started, there were a lot of people that were anointing the Toronto Argonauts as the Grey Cup champs before a playoff game even happened. We saw what the Montreal Alouettes did to them in that Eastern final, and then we had a very competitive Grey Cup and a bit of a surprise winner in the Montreal Alouettes. So a fantastic storyline to the playoffs last year.
And if you use hindsight as a measure, you could say, well, maybe that Alouettes victory in the Grey Cup wasn't meant to be really a big surprise. It was meant to be a portend of what was about to come. And for the Alouettes, if they can sustain this and be as strong as they are, it's going to take a lot of work. The teams in the East are no slouch. Even Hamilton, we can say, okay, great, they've only won twice. But they gave everything they could to Winnipeg on the road and almost pulled that game off. The Tiger Cats are getting close. Chris Jones being their D coordinator makes a huge difference.
He does. It was interesting to see the quick change in the defensive structure with 1 week of practice with Chris Jones helping out on the defense. It created some new looks. They can't completely rewrite the defensive playbook in a week, and nobody expects them to, but he has a different eye and a different philosophy on how a defense should attack, and we saw that. And Winnipeg had some holes in the offensive line, clearly, that allowed more pressure to get through, but it was a great game call by Chris Jones, and they almost pulled up the huge upset.
Now, talking about West-East matchups, the Saskatchewan Roughriders started the week in Toronto against the Argonauts in a game that came down to the last play. But in that, there is so much to discuss. There's two elements that came out of that final minute that really need attention. The first and foremost is the Roughriders and how they mismanaged the clock in the final minute. If you go back to that game, and you can find it on YouTube, the Roughriders get the ball back with 55 seconds to go. Now, they thought they were going to be up across their 30-yard line, but a holding penalty on the kick return pushed them back to their 8. In those types of circumstances with 55 seconds left, you're probably not thinking about going down and scoring. You're more likely, okay, we've got to be careful here. Let's play for overtime. But you're not wedded to that completely. So on first down, the Roughriders try a pass, and Trevor Harris gets sacked literally inches in front of the goal line. Ralph Hawley gets to him, and the Roughriders now are 2nd and 17 from their 1, and they have 50 seconds on the clock. The clock is wound in, so it means the 20-second clock and the game clock are synchronized. With 1 second left in that 20-second clock, Saskatchewan, for some reason, calls a timeout. Now, this is while a pass is being thrown to Keon Schaefer-Baker. He catches it. Would have been a first down. But you could tell that the players had kind of slowed down on the play because the whistle had gone. That stops the clock. When you wind the 20-second clock, that game clock won't go. The Roughriders then try again another pass. this time to Samuel Emelis. Now he's right at the first down line, but Fraser Sopik is also right there, and he knocks the ball from him. That stops the clock again. So now you're at your 1 yard line, third down to go with 26 seconds left. And the clock isn't going to move until that ball is snapped. Toronto gets the ball. They move one play forward after the punt return. And then Lirim Hajrullahu just pounds the stuffing out of that football through the back of the end zone. He's making sure that they're at least getting one, and he's not contacting an upright doing it.
And controversially, possibly that one was all they needed. And we can debate the Rouge. I don't know if we'll get into that this episode or not. The Riders did mismanage the clock. The timeout call with 31 seconds left, I believe, was Corey Mace worrying that the snap wasn't going to get off and they were going to take a time count violation, which would also lead to a loss of down, if I remember correctly, in the final minute of the game. So he was in a bit of panic mode. Unfortunately for him, the resulting play, if it was to stand, was possibly a first down, which would have enabled them to essentially run out the clock. I chalked that one up a little bit to rookie head coach. We've seen that in the past. Ryan Dinwiddie, famously in his first season with the Argonauts, had some disastrous clock management as well. He's gotten a lot better at it. It's learning the situation and trusting your players on the field, and I think that's where he fell down a little bit there. Overall, though, it was just poorly managed. Other than Trevor Harris doing a remarkable job of not giving up a safety, he was aware of where that goal line was and was not going to fall down in the end zone. So a great heads-up play by him. But you can't leave the other team with that much time in great field position when all they need is 1 point to win. And that, unfortunately, for the Roughriders, is what happened in this one. Lirim Hajrullahu, like you said, he was not going to come up short on that field goal by any means. He had enough to ensure they at least got the one.
Where the Roughriders really fell down was after the sack. If you run the ball again, or even if you decide to take the timeout with 1 second left on the 20-second clock, and then decide to run the football afterwards, you're kicking the football, let's say 27 seconds left on the clock, and the clock is running. You can pooch it down the field. If Janarian Grant runs for any length of time, he may run out the clock, and the game goes to overtime. That's where conventional thinking is you run the football, the clock matters more at this point, but the Roughriders, for whatever reason, still felt that a field goal was in the offing, or at least a single point, and for whatever reason, gambled from their own one, and it cost them.
It did. You're absolutely right. You need to be running the ball in those situations. And there's ways to punt the ball to eat up more clock as well. It's not necessarily a matter of booming it down, but get one end over end that's going to roll and bounce and make it more difficult for the returner to get a handle on it. That allows your coverage team to get down there and make a play as well. It would have been much more challenging for the Argonauts had they not had the field position when this one was run back by Janarian Grant, gave them enough space and enough time left on the clock to successfully pull off the single.
The Saskatchewan Roughriders were going into the wind at that moment. For Adam Korosik to kick that ball any further would have been a big chore. Therefore, clock management matters and trumps anything that you do in terms of trying to get first downs at that moment. Unfortunately for Saskatchewan, that's a hard lesson to learn. We can talk about the single point. People have argued that it was a miss. You shouldn't gain from a missed field goal. But Lirim Hajrullahu did not miss anything. He went up with full comprehension that he wanted to kick that ball as hard and as far, with wind assisted, down through the back of the end zone, so that there was no way that Saskatchewan could run the ball back and avoid the single. He wasn't so worried about the field goal. He knew with his leg he could get it to the back of the end zone. And he had to kick it 60 yards to do so. Let's give him credit.
Absolutely. That was the point of it. And I'm of the opinion that the Rouge should stay as is. It's not a failure. It's not a rewarding for a missed field goal. It's rewarding your team for kicking the ball through the goal area. It's a matter of the other team not winning the field position battle and allowing you to get into an offensive zone where you can score a point, whether it's 1, 3, or 6. The Argonauts got into that position. The only argument I can maybe understand that I've heard is that in order for a single to be awarded for a ball going through the end zone, it must bounce in play before going out. That's something that, if that rule came into effect, I could maybe live with. But I've heard other options of, well, it shouldn't count on a missed field goal after the 3-minute warning. If it's a point in the first minute, it's a point in the last minute. It doesn't matter the time left on the clock on a scoring play. I'm not going to even consider that a valid argument. And it's not often that we see a game won or lost on a walk-off single. I believe it was 4 years ago was the last time we saw one. Much like the Montreal Alouettes pulling off the short onside punt, it's an anomaly in the game that happens on occasion. And when it does, it should be celebrated and not deemed to be stupid and should be eliminated.
Boris Beatty was the last one to do it. He was with the Argonauts. They did it in Montreal. The whole notion that you can suddenly have points allowed and not allowed at different stages of the football game, to me, is absurd. Why would you allow a single in the first part of the game if you're not going to allow it at the end? I totally agree with you on that. I do not care for all of this argument. It basically like waking slumbering trolls, and they go, oh, I hate the 1 point. What are they doing up there? And they start typing on their keyboards, and then they disappear for a while again. I get tired of it. I can understand that maybe it's a disquieting way to lose because if you're the Roughriders, but then ask yourself this question. Everyone feels so sorry for the Roughriders. Well, what did they do to prevent this? What were they doing? They screwed up with the time clock. They let Janarian Grant get 15 yards up the field to make it a shorter attempt, and they didn't block the field goal attempt. I'm sorry, but if you're the Roughriders, stare in the mirror and ask yourself how you got there.
There's been an unusual number of player injuries over the past couple of weeks where an ambulance has come on the field to cart players off. We saw it with Luther Hakanavanu, Stanley Bryant, and now most recently Jalen Acklin. Is this a concerning trend?
That is a great question. I'm hoping it isn't. In each case, it's sort of a different sort of circumstance that brings about the necessity to bring the ambulance on the field. The Luther Hakanavanu play was a violent contortion of his body. I was scared for more than maybe just a concussion. I was afraid that maybe he broken his back. It looked so unnatural the way he had come down. The Stanley Bryant play, you can maybe speak to that more, but it seemed to me like he wasn't right from the moment the game started.
Yeah, actually, Coach Mike O'Shea in the post-game commentary mentioned that Stanley Bryant had been ill throughout the week as well. And it was a very humid game. It wasn't overly hot. I believe it was 24 Celsius, but the Humidex pushing it to 31. So when that humidity gets up, that can have its effect on players. It looks like he was battling some illness, got dehydrated, and got overheated. It didn't look like it was any kind of contact play. And by all indications, Stanley Bryant is going to be fine. But I think it was a matter of a very large man losing a lot of fluid and not being able to perform at his peak.
You could see just prior to him getting assisted that he had gone over to another offensive lineman, had tapped him on the shoulder and said, I can't do this. You could read his lips. And then as he turned, they had some assistance, and then his legs gave out. Jalen Acklin, he got a high pass, and it's always so dangerous when quarterbacks throw it high over the middle because you're totally exposed. Acklin had caught the ball but got flipped completely and landed on his back, and I wasn't sure exactly what had happened to him. Was it neck, back, concussion? Could have been all three. The circumstance, again, it necessitates an ambulance, but again, the training staff gets out there, the medical staff gets out there immediately, and they immobilize. They're doing the right thing.
They are, and they're taking every precaution, and that's the biggest thing in these situations, especially with a head or neck injury, is as much as that player wants to pop up and walk off the field under his own power, they need to immobilize, stabilize, and make sure that there's no further damage. The great news is all three of these players seem to be in decent shape as well. Taylor Powell is another one that was sent to hospital for observation. Niles Morgan had a rough night of playing contact and was responsible for both those injuries against Hamilton. Each of these, as you mentioned, were unique situations. It's not a matter of one particular type of play causing these injuries. And I just hope that this was a fluke couple of weeks and that we don't see any more of the ambulances on the field for the rest of the season.
It's just really, really tough to watch, and you just hope that nothing like this continues.
The command center is once again at the center of attention as Ryan Dinwiddie has raised some questions about replays following the overturned touchdowns against the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and he has been quoted as saying, "I don't know why we have a command center." I will go on the other side of this argument against Ryan Dinwiddie. I do think it's necessary, and if nothing else, these booth reviews proved that you did not score touchdowns.
Exactly. In both cases, the booth got it right, but in terms of possession or in terms of crossing the goal line. However, he did challenge for pass interference. And we could see that, especially in the pass deep to the corner, that the defender had reached across and grabbed the jersey, let go, just as the ball was getting to the receiver. And that's where I think he was getting more upset, was that had DeMonte Coxey been allowed to freely catch the football, in other words, be non-interfered with, then they would have scored a touchdown. As it was, I was still not completely convinced that he hadn't caught the ball because even the opposite side replay didn't really show that the ball had touched the ground. It seemed to flail between his arm and his leg. I can understand Dinwiddie's frustration because, let's face it, in that football game, Toronto owned the Saskatchewan Roughriders. They should have won 40-19, not 20-19. Part of it was their inability to cross that final barrier, that 1 yard line. That's something that they're going to have to work on. Him lashing out at the booth, I think, is a frustration about other things as well. It's not necessarily the command center that's at fault here.
Absolutely. And the booth is kind of finding its own way as well. They've had some shakeup over the last couple of weeks and a refocus on what they can overturn and how they go about it. I think there'll be a lot more clarity in the off season as they get a chance to decompress and reevaluate. But we saw also a couple of close reviewed plays in the Winnipeg-Hamilton game, one for pass interference that was deemed not to be interference. Again, there was a tug on the front of the jersey, but released with enough time to allow the Tiger Cats receiver a chance to catch the ball. The other one, a bit more controversially, was on a called catch to Tim White, where Brandon Alexander came up with the ball. It was called a catch by White on the field. The reviews that we got to see showed that he didn't really have possession at any point, and the ball never touched the ground, so it likely should have gone to Alexander, but the way that they are calling the game now, the play on the field stood.
It's almost as though the command center is trying to not get in the way of what's being called on the field. And they're going to, we talked about pendulums before, and I think the pendulum has really swung to the other side where they're trying to be non-interventionist. That's not the point of it. The point is clear and obvious, and emphasis on the obvious. Now, your definition of obvious is not my definition of obvious, nor is it our listeners' definition of obvious. We all have different interpretations. They have to find their way, and this is what happens. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
There is, and I've seen both Tiger Cats fans and Bomber fans upset with the booth in this game. Well, if that was called interference, then the ball would have been on the 1 yard line and Hamilton probably would have scored a touchdown. If the booth did their job and they deemed that a Brandon Alexander interception and not a Tim White catch, the Bombers probably would have won the game handily on a defensive stop, allowed them to continue on. Okay, so to me, that balances out. You've got one on each side. If they're both mad, it either means the booth is doing a really good job or a terrible job, but they're not biased towards one team or the other.
This booth business all goes back to May the 8th of 2014, where pass interference became an eligible part of booth review. And from that day forward, they have struggled mightily with interpretation. We've heard Dwayne Ford talk about you can't play frame by frame. At what point does a player actually interfere with another player? You open up a huge box of what ifs when you have judgment calls go for review. We've lived with it for 10 years. We're still fighting about it, which tells me that one of two things. Either it's that hard to assess, or maybe it's time for pass interference calls to be tossed. and just get them out of the way altogether. At least the ones where they go fishing for a pass interference call.
Yeah, it's the timing, it's the speed of which to make these calls. And Dwayne Ford nailed it. He said that defensive players can't play frame by frame. I don't know the perfect answer to it, because I do believe sometimes there are clear and obvious interference penalties that are missed and are very impactful on the outcome of the game. But I agree with you in the fishing for a pass interference. While he maybe got there a little bit early, he maybe had his arm over the receiver's arm. In the heat of the moment and in the speed of which those plays occur, I'd lean on the side of leaving the flag in your pocket.
Hey, this is Reed from the Markcast. You're listening to Third Down Gamble.
In this season, given that Nathan Rourke is back, would there have ever been a countenance by you that there'd be a question as to whether or not Nathan Rourke should be the starter for the BC Lions going forward?
Short answer is yes, and the reason I say that is because of the start Vernon Adams Jr. had this year. Nathan Rourke has come in with an incredible amount of hype and an even more incredible amount of pressure on his shoulders to perform for the BC Lions, given what he had done previously in a relatively short sample size. If you look at it now, I believe Nathan Rourke has 16 starts under his belt as a CFL quarterback with a record of 10 wins, 6 losses. Now, he was 10-1 against the rest of the CFL other than the Winnipeg Blue Bombers prior to his most recent loss this last week. And again, I think there's a lot to be said for the timing of inserting Nathan Rourke as your starting quarterback. The question right now is Rick Campbell's non-committal about who will start this weekend. I'm more concerned about the health of Vernon Adams than I am the ability of either of these two quarterbacks, given that leg injury he suffered against Winnipeg.
Vernon Adams certainly has had enough time to recover from that play. Again, when it's a knee injury, you're always cautious, and we can point to Trevor Harris and how immobile he is in the pocket with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. When he tries to shed pressure and take off on a run, he's lumbering. He's not running. He's lumbering. And for Vernon Adams Jr., who kind of his game really depends on his ability to be mobile, I would be very hesitant to throw him in too early, because if that knee has not completely recovered, you may set him back even further. Now, Nathan Rourke, yes, he has struggled to start the season, but in that game against Ottawa, he fumbles the football twice. Do you put that on him, or is that his offensive line not protecting him? And then the second part of that, his passing stats are decent. Do you worry that maybe he's not putting up the numbers that he had in that terrific year where he was all everything?
The game against Ottawa, he certainly looked better than he did against Winnipeg. I believe he had 8 completions against the Blue Bombers for the entire game. He had 9 completions on the first drive for them against Ottawa. He's settling in, and those fumbles are two-part. They're based on an offensive line not giving him adequate protection, and also you've got a quarterback in Nathan Rourke who refuses to give up on a play. He's a gamer. He's a scrambler. He tries to make things happen, and I think he was trying to be too evasive, and instead of throwing the ball into the third row, he's still trying to make a play, and in both of those situations, it got knocked out of his hand as he had it up, kind of cocked to throw.
Exactly. You can't necessarily blame the quarterback, because unless you're completely on a swivel up there, there's no way that you're going to see everything around you. And you're kind of depending on your running back, or at least your offensive line, to keep you protected so that you have time to look around. He did run the ball well. He had a huge run in that football game. Now that he's got an extra week of practice, I think that's going to help him settle in with the receiving core, and I think that's the biggest issue that he has. It's not so much that he's rusty or that he doesn't understand the playbook. It's just that he's working with individuals that he hadn't played with when he was in BC the last time, save for one.
Exactly. I have no worry about Nathan Rourke's ability to be a starting quarterback in the CFL. He'll get back there, and there's going to be a lot of change of tune if he goes out and throws for 350 yards and 4 touchdowns in his next start, and scrambles and runs for another 70 or 80, which he's quite capable of. We saw a 51-yard run this past week, which is his longest of his CFL career. So we know that athletic ability is still there. If I'm Rick Campbell right now, I'm definitely giving the ball to Rourke until I am 100% confident that Vernon Adams is healthy. Then you're going to get yourself into a situation like the Ottawa Red Blacks, where they have an abundance of wealth in that quarterback room. And that's what you want to see for BC. You want a healthy Rourke, a healthy Adams. And the two of them working together can really help steer things back in the direction that the BC Lions expect to be headed.
Bob Dice, when Drew Brown became available again to start for the Red Blacks, there was no illusion about what was going to happen. He came out and stated that Drew Brown was the number one and that Jeremiah Masoli was number two. And that had been throughout training camp, that was the pecking order in that quarterback. That helps codify everything and gives everybody a chance to figure out their place. Where you start musing about this, that, and the other thing, I don't know if Rick Campbell's doing anyone any favors. He could go out to the media and say, look, until otherwise noted, my quarterback is Nathan Rourke. Whether he comes back with Vernon Adams Jr. at a halftime of a game makes no difference under that circumstance.
And Bob Dice, to his credit, was proven right in putting Drew Brown back in there. All he did was throw for 390 yards in his return from injury. It's the second time this season that Drew Brown's been over 375 yards passing in a game. You can't argue that this was a wrong call. Yes, it was a feel-good story to see Jeremiah Masoli get a start, get a win, and play well. But they brought Drew Brown into Ottawa for a reason, and that was to be their number one guy. He's proven that he deserves the job. 390 yards, 3 touchdowns was a pretty good exclamation point on that.
And the Lions, ultimately, for them, the problem is that they haven't won a football game since they defeated the Roughriders. And that's where the struggle is. And that's why I think Rick Campbell is kind of grasping a little bit, trying to see, well, did I make the wrong call here by starting Rourke so quickly? Maybe if Adams had been available to me, I should have gone with him. If BC can get something that will help them out of this losing streak, maybe it's Matthew Betts, as he has been released by the Detroit Lions. There's something that their defensive line has been good but not great. Maybe having him back would really help.
It could. I know the Detroit Lions were high on him given that he had 18 sacks in the CFL last year, but it appears he's unable to crack a roster of the U.S. Lions. I would not be surprised to see him back on the BC Lions. However, that Nathan Rourke contract maybe has them a little bit tight on salary cap, and I'm not sure where they find the room to add Matthew Betts.
There's always room. The question for Neil McAvoy or Rick Campbell or both of them is, do you want to bust the cap? You can. You just pay the fine. Now, they don't want to go too far because they've already opened the bank for Nathan Rourke. I guess is how much is Rourke making. Caps are there. Penalties are there. It's your choice, right?
And we've seen teams go over the cap, but not over that $100,000 barrier. And that's where things really start to get punitive for a team. Anything above the salary cap, but below 100,000 over is a dollar for dollar penalty. Once you break that 100,000 barrier, you start looking at more money, possible loss of draft picks, etc. So it does get a lot more punitive. We know the Grey Cup is in BC this year. How badly do they want to be there, and how much are they willing to spend to accomplish it?
Well, remember, too, Betts would only be on a half a year. That would devalue that contract in terms of the salary cap as well. It's just a question of getting the deal done if Betts isn't going to be picked up anywhere else in the NFL. I
guess the positive for Rick Campbell and the BC Lions is at this point they're only a half point out of first place in the West. So you can second guess your losing streak, but they also got off to a very hot start. So the team has the ability. It's a tough call. I would hate to be in that position. Like I said, if it's me right now, I think Nathan Rourke gets the start. If Vernon Adams is back to 100% and Rourke has continued to struggle, you reevaluate. But at this point, I think you've got to go with the guy that you brought back to all that fanfare.
Good or bad for the BC Lions, the month of September, their opponents are Eastern Division. While the other Western teams are beating each other up, the Lions are still trying to finish off their Eastern schedule. That hasn't been friendly to them. It does give them time so that they're not playing in 4-point games while they figure this out.
Well, that can be good and bad. You win against a Western opponent, as you say, that's a 4-point game. if they continue to win against the East, but another team strings together some wins in the West, you're not really any further ahead.
True enough. You want to face the team that you need to beat to get that position. For the Lions, while they're off playing the other conference, they've got to make hay while the opportunity is there. If they fail against the East, let's say that Montreal and Toronto come in and take them out, and they go 2-3 or 3-2 overall, will they be any further ahead? First things first, they got to get past this losing streak. But once they do, coming down the stretch, they do face the West. They've got to be set up for it.
Hot off the news that Nathan Rourke has signed a 3-year deal with the BC Lions, the Montreal Alouettes announced this week that they have signed receiver Austin Mack to a contract extension through 2028. Is this a trend that we're going to see more long-term contracts in the league?
It would be great if this could happen. Listening to the broadcast on TSN, there was some discussion that Austin Mack was looking for a long-term tenure with somebody, and he preferred it to be the Alouettes. He knew he had their rights. This was the team that had originally signed him. He wanted to stay there, and they've got a good thing going. Why would you want to leave? And for him and for the Alouettes, I think it's a win-win. If it's a long-term contract that we're starting to see as the beginning of more, I'm all for it. Nathan Rourke going for 3 is great. Vernon Adams Jr. is on a 3-year deal. For fans, it gives you more opportunity to put on a jersey with that number and trust that it'll be there and cheer for somebody that's been a part of that franchise. I think we got sort of lost in the abyss, and I'll blame Chris Jones for part of this, where players became a rotational element of the game, and nobody you knew last week was going to be there this week. They've got to solidify things. Go back to when you and I were kids, when you knew what the lineup was from week to week.
I love this signing, and it's a great feather in the cap of the CFL as well, to have a player of Austin Mack's caliber, an American player who has taken a look at the NFL. Now, it doesn't mean he's not going to get another shot south of the border at some point, but he is showing commitment to the CFL, to the Montreal Alouettes, and I hope that this is a trend that we see more 3- and 4-year contracts. So many have been on those 1-year and an option deals forever. This is fantastic to see. He was a breakout star last year in the CFL. He's got a half season this year to prove that this was a great move to bring him back, and I think he will. He had a couple of catches in the first game this past week. Mack and Cody Fajardo need to work on some of their timing and routes a little bit, but I think it's a great push for that Alouettes offense, and maybe a weapon that will allow the offense to win some games and not necessarily just relying on the defense.
To tell you how important he is to that Montreal offense, let's go back to the Grey Cup and that third down play at the end of the game that Cole Speaker caught on the sideline. The Winnipeg defenders on that side jump a route, and who's running that route? Austin Mack. They think that's the go-to guy. If you have a receiver that can divert defense's attention, you've got a winner.
Third down.
Touchdown Pacific in Victoria, BC will start the weekend on Saturday as the Ottawa Redblacks and the BC Lions tangle once again. The Lions are 3.5-point favorites at home. Not sure who's going to start a quarterback, but my money is on Nathan Rourke. Do you think that's fair that the Lions are favored given their losing streak? Or do you think that's because it's so hard to sweep a team in back-to-backs that the money's got to go that way?
I kind of feel like the Ottawa Redblacks are the Rodney Dangerfield this year. They're not getting any respect from anybody, and all they've done is put together the second-best record in the league so far and have really not backed down from anyone. That being said, I do like the Lions at home in this one. They're trending in the right direction with their quarterback change. It was a competitive game against Ottawa, and it was the turnovers and the mistakes that really cost the BC Lions. I do believe they'll be a better team at home. I'm going to take the Lions, but I think Ottawa keeps it close enough that I would take Ottawa plus the points.
I'm going to agree with you on that. I don't know that Ottawa can sweep the Lions. The Lions, of course, with a sold-out audience, they are going to be all behind them. This should be a fun event. I'm just so happy that we're seeing the West get involved in these touchdown events. I'm with you.
Game 2 of the weekend, sold out Mosaic Field, as expected, for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers Saskatchewan Roughriders Labor Day Classic, or day before Labor Day Classic, technically. The Roughriders 2.5-point favorites at home. This has to be based on the tradition of the Labor Day weekend and the Roughriders' winning record in those games. The Bombers are one of the hottest teams in the league right now, coming in against a struggling Saskatchewan Roughriders. 2.5 points. This one could be a great game.
Last year it went into overtime, and of course that was Jake Dolegala, a recent cut to the BC Lions, who led the Roughriders in that football game. The Blue Bombers are not as strong as they were last year. Adam Bighill is on the 6th game with a hamstring problem. Stanley Bryant should be back in the offensive line, but they've got other problems on offensive line that they have to overcome. Their offense has been terrible. Even with Kenny Lawler, he had 2 catches against the Tiger Cats? My bigger problem is who starts at quarterback for the Roughriders. If it's Trevor Harris, he's a sitting duck, and the Bombers' defensive line, which is really rounding into shape, is going to have a feast getting to him. With the Roughriders at 2.5-point favorites, I'm not liking it. I'm going to take the Blue Bombers against that.
These Labor Day games, this is my favorite weekend of the year, is these Labor Day matchups. We've seen crazy things happen in this game in Regina year after year. The Bombers had won a couple in a row, and the Roughriders bounced back and got the win last year. You're right about Winnipeg's offense. They are struggling to put together points, and Zach Collaros was pretty much terrible in the second half of the game last week against the Hamilton Tiger Cats, except in the final minute and 30 seconds when he led them down the field for a winning touchdown pass to one Kenny Lawler. The big thing for me is, can the Blue Bombers overcome the holes in that offensive line and get Brady Oliveira established in the running game? The Roughriders do not give up a lot of yards on the ground. They're the best team in the league against the rush. And for Winnipeg to have some success, they're going to have to find a way to get Brady in the game. And that might be more of those dump passes to the sides as opposed to just trying to run him up the middle. We're going to be in attendance in this one. Looking forward to it. I don't know who to call in this one. I'm going to take the Roughriders at home. I think the Labor Day crowd is going to push the Riders to victory in this one. Before
we get away from this, Brady Oliveira was limping at the end of the game against Hamilton. He gutted it out to play in that final drive, but he was hurting. I don't know how that's going to play out going forward. Labor Day Monday in Hamilton, the Tiger Cats, coming back from a very close game against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, now face the Toronto Argonauts. Toronto is 4.5-point favorites going into this football game. Chad Kelly, I'll say, looked good against the Roughriders. Rusty in the first quarter, but seemed to settle underneath, and that Toronto offense was far more dynamic with him in charge than they were with the other 2 quarterbacks.
They were, and if not for some fantastic defensive play by Saskatchewan on the goal line, this game could have got out of hand for the Argonauts. I took Hamilton against the 9.5-point spread last week against the Bombers. I'm not so optimistic that they can beat a 4.5-point spread this time around. I like the Argonauts on the road. Hamilton, although they were competitive against Winnipeg, again didn't show a lot on offense either. The defense played better, but I'm still taking the favored Toronto Argonauts in this one on the road.
Does Bo Levi Mitchell start at quarterback for the Hamilton Tiger Cats, or is it Taylor Powell? Is he ready? If it's Powell, far more dynamic in terms of lateral movement, can put more pressure on that Toronto defense. That Toronto defense is underrated. They are fantastic. Now that they got Chad Kelly back, I just don't see how Hamilton has enough to stop them. Even with Chris Jones flexing his muscle and showing 1,000 different looks with that Hamilton defense against him, another week as the starting quarterback in practice, another week of getting used to those receivers again, I would lay heavily that Toronto's going to win and cover.
The final game of Labor Day weekend, the Edmonton Elks head south to Calgary to take on the Stampeders at McMahon Stadium. The home team Stampeders are favored by 2.5 against a much improved Edmonton Elks team that we've seen over the recent weeks. Who are you taking in this one?
I'm liking Calgary at home. Edmonton, to me, has been great that they've been moving forward, but unless Trey Ford is their quarterback in that football game, I don't see how Edmonton's going to win. And the problem I have with McLeod Bethel Thompson is every start, it seems like there's a period of the game that he just disappears for a while, whether defenses catch on to what he's doing, figure out what his tells are, but there's something about his play. And we even saw it Edmonton and Montreal on Sunday, where Edmonton's offense generated a negative 2 yards in the third quarter. You can't do that in the second half. That's my problem. If Trey Ford starts, then all bets are off. This game is going to be a wild game. But if it's McLeod Bethel Thompson, yes, he can hit the short darts and he can make the crossing patterns. But are Calgary going to worry about that? I don't think so. And I like the Stampeders if it's McLeod Bethel Thompson.
The Elks have really struggled in the third quarter this season. They have scored a total of 19 points in third quarters so far. That's something that they're going to have to overcome. You're 100% correct on that one. They need to come out and start the second half with a bang. It sounds like Trey Ford is getting close to being ready. They had him listed as a rib injury. I'm trending towards the Elks in this one. I think they're going to go into Calgary, pull off the upset, cover the 2.5 points, and really make a push to try to knock Calgary down into that 5th spot in the West in the standings. I'm taking the Elks.
It's part of a huge stretch for the Elks. They've got the Bombers twice and they've got the Stampeders twice. If they don't do it now, this season is a loss.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble podcast. Audio worth watching.